Sentry mode activated. Target acquired.
Hey there hunters, I want to talk today about arcane builds in Elden Ring and explain how arcane scaling works and kind of why it's bad. Now I've been playing mostly exclusively arcane poison builds since day one and I regret the whole thing like wholeheartedly. I want to explain what's going on and hope that people will learn from my mistakes and play just something else. So without further ado, let's just get into this. Alright, so the arcane stat. From the tooltip, we can see that it says it helps it boost discovery, which is the item drop rate, and boost immunity and vitality. Overall, not very helpful, and not a great stat, right? What it doesn't tell you is arcane also buffs debuff application, and by that I mean like all debuffs. Poison, bleed, frostbite, madness, just about everything. Even if it doesn't say so, or if it doesn't scale naturally with arcane in like frostbite's case. Now before we get into that, let's talk about arcane scaling in general. Some weapons have natural arcane affinity and scale off arcane, and what you may notice is that arcane scaling is bugged currently. Weapons that have arcane scaling and any other damage type besides physical get 0 scaling for stats, which is a shame. Weapons like Reduvia do scale properly with arcane as they only have physical damage, but other weapons, and there's a lot, don't get any damage bonuses at all. Yes, this is a bug and hopefully will be addressed in the future, but yeah, arcane scaling straight up doesn't really work right now. Some weapons like the Serpent's Bow I feel aren't getting proper scaling either, even though they are physical only, as I have a +9 bow with descaling in strength, dex, and arcane, and I'm getting like +30 damage, which is literally nothing. Now other weapons that give you arcane scaling too via poison or bleed infusions seem to cap out at descaling, which I'm not sure if that's a bug or just terrible because it's never getting any better, like other stats. Now infusing for other things like int or face scaling with fire or frost can get to B or A tier scaling in those stats, which is just insane by comparison. I'm not sure why arcane scaling always caps out at about D. Yes, poison and bleed get additional effects, but so does like frostbite and elemental damage that pierces physical defenses. So yeah, weapon scaling is kind of all jank right now and not really working for arcane, and arcane doesn't really feel viable in that regards. So let's move on to what arcane does scale, and that is the statuses such as bleed, poison, frostbite, etc. It does help the build up amount, not the actual damage or the ticks from these ailments. So you can see on a poison infused weapon with 40 arcane, you get over 100 poison, and in a poison infused weapon with 14 arcane, you get like high 80s. It's really not that much different for such a hefty stat investment. Bleed gets increased as well by a similar amount, but the status cap is based upon the weapon's level. Scarlet Rot, however, does not seem to get bonuses from arcane stat at all, which is super lame. And in fact, infusing these Scarlet Rot weapons with something else besides standard traditional like scaling seems to give them lower Scarlet Rot values, from like 55 to 50 on most weapons. Now the increase in buildup is technically working, and yes, you can see that it does increase with the arcane stat, and you can build a actual functional build around that, but I feel like such an investment into the arcane stat is not worth the minor amount of stat buildup. The difference between 14 and 40 arcane for like poisoning is applying it in like 3 hits over 2, and in bleed it's like applying in 3 hits either way, so no real gain there. Arcane does not, and I repeat, does not increase status damage. Poison will always do the same damage, which is dependent on the target's actual immunity stat, and usually tick rates for poison are about between 7 and 10 damage, which is just fucking awful. It's definitely not worth the investment. Bleed also has the same fixed percent damage when it procs, and while getting more procs with more buildup is effectively more DPS, the investment required is usually not worth it, as you can get more damage with just standard infusions and using like the Seppuku Ashes of War to apply bleed your weapons regardless, or using like a bleed grease. Now speaking of greases, arcane actually does not help greases at all. You do not gain more application or application damage from greases based on arcane stat, which is also quite the shame. Yes, it kind of shows that there is no scaling on the item itself, but I would still have hoped that the arcane would actually scale the build up somewhat, not so much the damage applied. So poison grease and bleed grease do not scale better if you have a different Ashes of War on and then just use a grease to get the element that way, so don't bother. Though Occult still does give B scaling and arcane stat, which is great, but Occult means you cannot apply greases to your weapons for whatever reason, even though you only have physical damage. It's nice for weapons that have natural effects such as bleed or poison on their weapons, because it will help scale those a bit more, but otherwise not too helpful compared to just, standard scaling on a quality build. Now the last thing I want to talk about are items that work with poison and rot buildup. These are the Mushroom Crown Helmet and the Centipede Exaltation Talisman thing. These are good and bad at the same time. Now what's bad is that they are super finicky on their wording. So it says here that rot or poison in the nearby vicinity on the talisman will trigger it, and on the headpiece it says when an enemy nearby is affected by poison or rot. Very different wordings, but they work exactly the same. So if you poison an enemy at range with, say, like a bow and poison arrows, you don't get any buff at all. Super lame. Likewise, if you are in the vicinity of poison or rot, like in Caelid or the Damn Lake of Rot, no buff at all. Yeah, again, super weird. Now, it only seems to trigger if you actually apply the poison or rot in melee range of the target when they actually receive the poison or rot debuff. And then this buff lasts about 15 seconds, not too long sadly. It does stack with both the charm and the helmet, which is nice, and you do get a fair amount of attack from it. And you can actually proc it off yourself if you are getting poisoned or scarlet rot, but that's about it. It is a shame that it doesn't really work at ranged, and a shame that it doesn't work when there's obvious rot or poison in the area, but it technically does work from a melee perspective. And the damage bonuses are pretty nice, and the fact that they stack is pretty cool. The other problem though is that you can't reapply the status without reapplying the poison as well. So an enemy that is continuously poisoning will not continuously proc the effects for these. You have to reapply the initial tick of poison for these to affect. So if you have an enemy that's ticking for poison for 2 minutes and your buff lasts for 15 seconds, well, you're kind of shit out of luck at that point. So all that being said, I just want to say that it shows that Arcane really doesn't help all that much, and it's definitely not a set you should be heavily investing in, like I had, unfortunately. Yes, it does help apply statuses a hair bit faster, but since it doesn't scale their damage, nor does it really help their build up all that much, it's really kind of a dumb stat. So yeah, I just want to make sure you guys aren't falling into the same pit traps I did, where I'm trying to build a unique setup here with poison and bleed and other stuff and kind of playing off each other. And Arcane, which is supposed to help on those, doesn't seem to be working all that well right now. But yeah, that's all for me though. Thank you all for watching, and good luck out there, hunters.